Okay, Antonio Damasio video. Yeah, I think we'll finish up for the time being anyway. So I have watched a couple of more of his interactions with people and interviews and speeches and whatnot. And a lot of it is sort of redundant. So the basic idea, he did a lot of research with people who had damage to their frontal lobe. And what they lost through that damage is kind of, I don't know why, I mean, I think they could have done like lobotomy patients even, was some of their capacity to emotionally live. I mean, people became unreactive in terms of recognizing things emotionally. So I've used the example of the color red, that we, generally speaking, all of us have an emotional reaction to red that we don't sense it automatically. It's not like we're saying, I'm emotionally reacting to the color red. It's in our subconscious, because red is the color of blood, and it's the color of fire. It's the color of a lot of aggressive things in the world, and that we psychologically, generally speaking, they do this with MRIs and all this crap, that we react differently to different colors emotionally, and that same effect is happening to everything we put in a category. Everything we recognize as something gets tainted with the emotions that we're experiencing when we're interacting with that thing. So he calls them maps, that we map the world with our senses, not just visually, but auditorial maps and texture maps. And I'm not going to quibble over words. I don't think a map is a very good way to describe it, but it's a representation. And I would argue that what's also being represented is what the body in general is feeling, and that's the sense of that's something superimposed on the map. So if senses are sensing, if you have a broken leg and you experience something, it might be likely that while you have a pain and you're experiencing something, that pain might get mapped onto the experience. So let's say you go to Disneyland and you have a headache. You might end up mapping in your memory many of the events may be tainted with that headache, with the experience of the headache, the tension created. All that stuff will be mapped onto the interactions you're having, and so now you might not like Mickey Mouse in the future. Mickey Mouse might have a taint to him, and this is conditioning basically. So it's a concept I deal with a lot. It's a big part of my philosophy, is this idea of conditioning, and the fact that we viscerally react to things. It decides the programming of much of what means anything to us in our lives rolls out of conditioning. Your sexual preferences, food preferences, lots of different kinds of aesthetic preferences will be dictated by this conditioning. And what happens early in life is hard to rewrite conditioning, because conditioning is these maps, and they have to be constantly overlaid on each other. And so I guess the argument would kind of be made that if there's red, on the map, there's some colors that are harder to cover with new maps. So if you have certain colors in your map, those even positive experiences, it'll take a layers and layers of positive experiences to break that, to cover that old paint. So I'd use that analogy, that there's some paint that just keeps bleeding through. There's some experiences that are bad enough that the blood will just keep seeping through, no matter how much new gauze you put on it in terms of positive experiences. And that's the catch of reconditioning. It's difficult to recondition a person. I've often mentioned the movie A Clockwork Orange, because it deals with the subject of reconditioning, and that it's very traumatic to have to reorient your subjective, subconscious reflexes, the maps that you have, to repaint the maps of your character. It's hard to repaint that. Usually you're kind of stuck with what you have before the age of 18, because number one, I think they're laid down in heavier paint early, and the new layers are thinner and thinner as you get older, and it gets harder and harder to cover those old layers of how you define a category, how you define something recognized as a thing, and emotionally, or the totality of your body's memory, your brain's memory of that thing, what it extracted from that thing and holds in your subconscious as its representation. So there's a distinction here, I think, between the idea of which we intellectually know something and how we personally know something. So these are two different things. The logic you use in manipulating categories and ideas, you're not manipulating your visceral understanding. So you're not manipulating the maps in your psychology. You're manipulating maps in your philosophy, your knowledge base, and your knowledge base is a different database. So you can understand something as a principle, and this is what he sort of found with these patients with the frontal lobe difficulties, is they could understand right and wrong, they could understand hot, cold, they could understand the nature of something intellectually, but they had no way to convert the understanding into any kind of, they didn't have any emotion. So when you connected, when they were put in a situation where action was required, they would often not react as if they had understanding. They would act as if they didn't have understanding, because their understanding didn't have any strength. So you could know it in principle. It's like you could know that, well, there's starving people in China, and you still shove your extra food into the garbage can. You give it a thought, but you don't have any strength of emotion to say, I'm going to do something about this. And it's only when, so that's what I sort of argue, is that we can think in abstractions like a sociopath in a sense, just logically, without emoting. And then we can also wait and more personally think about something. So it's like the difference between doing math and doing, talking to your girlfriend or your whoever. Those two events are two different things. One you might be doing from your visceral reaction, from your emotions, and one you're doing is just an abstract concept. And like I said, those are kind of different things. And when you need to act, though, you usually are going to need to have the motivational mechanism is going to be the emotional one. You need to have emotion to get yourself to actually act. So action is going to require the interference of a feeling, the interference of something from that harder map, from that more personal map. It's like you have to act personally. You can think abstractly, but you have to act personally. So action has to go through the old mapping center, the hard maps of conditioning, where thought doesn't. So you can think abstractly, independent of the old maps you have written, your conditioning. But you have to act through your conditioning. You have to go through the hard maps to act. And so that's where it breaks down for these people with the frontal lobe problem, is that the hard maps, the conditioned reactions, don't exist anymore. So they can't take an idea, throw it into the emotional map, and have the emotional map create an action. So even though they know something's wrong, they won't react to the word wrong. They won't have an emotional reaction that says, I must stop that because it's wrong. So there's no red, there's no taint to the color that gives them warning that says, I must now emotionally react. What stops you at the stop sign isn't the word stop, and isn't necessarily the word red. It's the recognition, emotionally. You emotionally stop at the sign, because it triggers that reaction. And for them, they might go right through a stop sign because there'll be no emotional reaction. It'll just be a theoretical statement, stop. And they might not pay attention. They might not be able to react fast enough, even, you could argue. they might have to find other methods to get it through, to make it react, because they won't have a reactive emotional self to react more immediately. Maybe that's the better way to put it. There'll be no immediacy, and therefore they can never, they'll get caught up in things like he did experiments with gambling, and the people with this damage would always choose very high risk gambling versus sensible, proven winning ways. So they would end up caught up in losing ways, and they didn't seem to be able to break the cycle of losing because they seemed to have no immediacy about correcting it. They would recognize they're losing, but they somehow couldn't correct for it because they couldn't create any emotional necessity to do something about it. So anyway, this is getting very more deep than I wanted to get. The bottom line is, there's nothing I've heard this guy say that I find a huge bunch of conflict with. There's just nothing. Like I said, I mean, he does seem to sometimes he uses the self as a, yes, this is something generated long in our past with reptiles, and then other times he talks as if the self is some sort of more complex identity issue of reflection. But the bottom line is, I think he is acknowledging the fact that selfness is created by feelings, and that certainly would be my argument. That as soon as you have a feeling, you have a self, would be what I would say. There's no way to avoid it. So, yeah, in the end, there's nothing really disagreeable. So maybe in the future I'll come back to this. Maybe there'll be some new thing he did that'll be fascinating. Some of these are produced poorly. You know, I watched this one at the New York Public Library, kind of a waste of time. You know, they played music over it. It was just, you know, yeah, it just wasn't, it's not a very good idea. And then he speaks on a lot of, you know, he did some George Soros economics thing, and, you know, he didn't talk about economics, he talked about the brain, and it just seems like a strange forum for that, so. But whatever, I guess you take whatever invites you get, you know. And, yeah, so we'll move on to the next guy, I guess, Tom Metzinger. I think that's the other guy, right? So if somebody, you know, you want to do me a favor and put a list of names you think I should go. But most importantly, I want the ones Fred mentioned. So if you can find the ones Fred is all horny for, and just put their names in the comments so I can go look them up, I'd appreciate that. And we'll see what happens. See where I can find one of these professors that I disagree with fundamentally. That might be more interesting than the ones I don't disagree with at all, pretty much. So anyway, until next time. It's been interesting. Didn't learn anything, but it's been interesting. Well, I mean, I learned about mole rats, which wasn't, I already knew about mole rats. Well, no, he called them prairie voles. Yeah, pretty much just mole rats. Anyway, until next time.